Donnie here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now from human rights in China to the country's economic relationship with the United States. Top U.S. business leaders met with Presidents Obama and Hu Jintao on Wednesday to call for increasing exports to China. Just before the meeting, the White House announced a list of trade deals with China totaling $45 billion. The list includes a $19 billion deal with Boeing for aircraft technology and a package with General Electric that's expected to generate more than $2 billion in U.S. exports. After meeting with executives from several U.S. corporations, Obama said he hoped to ease some of the friction over trade between the U.S. and China.
Even with China's enormous population, the United States still does more trade with Europe than it does with China. That, I think, gives an indication of the amount of progress that can be made if we are consulting with each other, if we are hearing specifically from businesses in terms of how we can ease some of the frictions that exist in our trading relationship. And so my hope is that today, in the brief time that we have, we'll be able to hear some concrete ideas about how we make sure that the trade is fair, that there is a level playing field, how can we protect intellectual property, how can we promote innovation, how can both of our governments remove barriers to trade and barriers to job creation. And with China's growing middle class, I believe that over the coming years we can more than double our exports to China and create more jobs here in the United States.
Later today, President Hu plans to address trade and economic concerns at the U.S.-China Business Council in Washington. Joining us now to discuss the U.S.-China relationship in more depth is Robert Scott, senior international economist with the Economic Policy Institute, a D.C.-based think tank that focuses on economic condition of low- and middle-income Americans. Staying with us is Mark Blecker, who is the professor of politics and East Asian studies at Oberlin College and author of several books, including China Against the Tide. Robert Scott, let's begin with you on China's economy and its significance here.
Well, China is perhaps one of the United States' most significant trading partners, and we have the most unequal trading relationship with China of any country in the world. We import almost 5 times as much from China as we export to them. Over the last 9 years, the United States has lost about 2.5 million jobs due to growing trade deficits with China, more than 500,000 jobs in the last year alone. We've lost jobs in every state. We've lost jobs in every congressional district in the country. And I've produced studies that have documented all of this.
Yet, Mr. Scott, none of that was part of the discussion between President Obama and President Hu in the past day.
Well, that's correct. I think in these discussions, unfortunately, President Obama has assumed the position of salesman-in-chief for companies like Boeing and General Electric, who are actually engaged, along with many other multinational businesses, primarily in outsourcing American jobs to China. So much of the discussion concerned the terms under which U.S. firms could do business in China and that sort of thing. President Obama seems to have a gap in his vocabulary. He almost never mentions the word imports. He talks constantly about exports, and that's all they've talked about yesterday in the negotiations. They never talk about the vast excess of imports over exports, and that's what's driving trade and trade-related job loss here in the United States.
Mark Blecker, I'd like you to respond to that, but also to talk about much of these imports are based on cheap Chinese labor. And one of the things that's happened in the last couple of years is this amazing upsurge among Chinese workers, seizing factories, demanding huge increases in wages. How do you see that developing in terms of the vast dissent that you've talked about that exists within Chinese society, and how that will impact on future trade and imports to the U.S.?
2 comments. On the employment question, while there's no question that China has attracted a certain amount of employment from the U.S. and that the U.S. has suffered a certain amount of job loss to China, I worry that we're using China as a whipping boy for our employment problems. If you look back over the past 30 years, the whole neoliberal period that we've had, the vast majority of employment losses in this country have not been due to outsourcing. They have been due to technological upgrading. And that's an inevitable problem. And the U.S. government, over all those years, over many presidents, has not had an active labor market policy to try to help us cope with that by upgrading our labor force. Instead, we've cut support for education and technology and so on. So I haven't seen the Obama administration do much about the enormous job losses in this country over the past 2 years. I think they've tried, and most of the responsibility for this goes to opposition in Congress, to spending more money for job stimulation. But to use China as a whipping boy for our employment problems, I think is something we ought to be wary about. As far as your second question, the tremendous upsurge in labor protest in China is something that is amazing. It's something that we should actually applaud. On the one hand, it shows that what I was saying earlier, that there's huge scope for political expression in China. In every Chinese city, every single day, there are protests about labor issues, about people being evicted from their homes, and so on. And these people don't get arrested and all thrown into jail. If they did, they wouldn't keep protesting. Instead, the government has figured out a strategy of coming in, paying them off, and trying to cope with their problems. Rising wages in China, improved working conditions in China, are one of the best ways to help American workers, because it's sweatshop labor is what's attracting so much of the employment loss that we do have with China. And then we have a race to the bottom where wages and working conditions are depressed here to meet Chinese levels. The best thing we can do is to help encourage the growth of a lively labor movement in China. The American labor movement is beginning to do this. I would like to hear critics of human rights in China talk more, as Sharon did, about rights of workers and farmers, rather than just imprisoned political dissidents. I think that's a good thing for American working people, but it's also a good thing for the American economy as a whole, because if we stop relying on so much Chinese imports, because they become a little more expensive with improved conditions in China, then that can only help revive our economy here.
Some of the major deals that were made, the announcement yesterday, for example, of, what was it, $19 billion deal for 200 Boeing airplanes. Also, General Electric announced 5 agreements with Chinese partners, including a joint venture to for aircraft avionics. Talk about the significance of this, Robert Scott, and also, I mean, among those who were at the dinner, and including the heads of GE and Boeing and Microsoft and Carlyle Group, was Bob King, the head of UAW, United Auto Workers.